for a candidate forum. That's for what? So good evening to everyone that's here with us tonight. This is wonderful. Anytime you can get engaged in the political process, it's a great time. So we're here tonight to talk to some amazing candidates, to hear from them and listen to them tell us about their platforms, what they're about, why they should be our next candidate for 8018. And thank you for everyone for showing up. But I first have to give thanks, of course, as the director of ACE Oakland, to my members and all of the ACE family from around the state of California, for the people that are on as panelists right now, but all of the people who couldn't make it tonight. Shout out to ACE, to all the Killer Bee family, and also to the Courage Campaign for being our partner and making this event happen tonight. My name is Carol Fife. I am the director of ACE Action Oakland and ACE Institute. And tonight is an exercise in democracy. And so we will give the candidates opening statement remarks and 2 minutes each.
Thank you so much. I'm Mia Bonta. I'm the daughter of a socialist father and a Democrat activist mother who named me after a revolutionary, leaving some pretty big shoes to fill. As activists, my parents were making the same demands for justice that the Black Panthers were making here in Oakland: policing the police, a right to housing, food security, and equity in education, issues that 50 years later we're still fighting for. My parents taught me about the power of being an advocate through service, and I've been fighting for our children and East Bay communities for over 25 years. I come to my work in our community not from theory or a lens, but from my own lived experience, and I see myself in so many of our young brothers and sisters. I grew up experiencing what it was like to watch a strong Black Latina woman have to make trade-offs at the end of the month between paying the rent, paying a doctor's bill, or putting food on the table. I worked my way through college and law school and still graduated with over $154,000 of student loan debt with my partner in life and partner in service. I'm working for the East Bay children and families, and I've seen our community displaced, dismissed, and dying at the hands of supposed protectors and trapped by systems that were not built to see us succeed. I set up my business in West Oakland. I was proud to be able to be a part of the West Oakland community in that way. And now I'm a school board president in Alameda, and I work every day to fulfill the promise of scholarships and college opportunity for Oakland's children. I'm running for assembly because we here in 8018 can no longer be displaced from the State House. The East Bay has not seen a Black woman to Sacramento since the Honorable Barbara Lee, and it is such an honor to have her endorsement. I'm running because we have a lot of work to do, and our representation, our experience, and our voice matters now more than ever. Thank you so much for having me join and be a part of this forum. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you for those statements. Janani, and I apologize if I say your name wrong. I just call you Janani. Can you please help me with that so I don't botch it?
Janani.
And your last name?
Ramachandran.
Ramachandran. There we go. So Janani, you're up next.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Janani Ramachandran. I'm an activist, social justice attorney, and proud member of 3 different Oakland tenant unions. And if elected, I would be just 1 out of 3 tenants out of 120 state lawmakers. I was driven to run for this seat because of the community members that I supported who were experiencing evictions during this pandemic. Elderly Oaklanders, survivors of domestic violence, children with disabilities. And these families, like tens of thousands across California in this past year, were evicted because our moratorium, which expires just 1 day after this special election, did not go far enough. I am driven to run for this seat because while fighting alongside state tenant unions and movements like ACE for a stronger moratorium and to cancel the rental debt, while sharing stories of pain of our community members to our supposedly progressive lawmakers, their responses were consistently a resounding, "That's sad, but no, I'm not going to try to do anything about it because the corporate interests are just too strong." I promise to never use the excuse of saying, "I'm not going to try to fight because it's too hard." So I am fighting for a true eviction moratorium during the post-pandemic recovery, to repeal Costa-Hawkins and the Ellis Act, to enact a right to counsel, to develop a 10-year plan for homelessness, And I'm proud to be supported by organizations that also believe it's time to center the voices of tenants who makes up 60% of this district, including Oakland Tenants Union, the California Democratic Party Progressive Caucus, Our Revolution, ILWU, Oakland East Bay Democratic Club, multiple former Black Panthers, tenant and unhoused community activists and faith leaders, and so much others. So join us to fight back against developers and landlord lobbies, center our voices, and take back our power. Thank you.
Thank you, Janani. And I just want to say, as an individual who just went through this process and was only recently elected and started working in office in January, it's not easy to get all of your thoughts in 2 minutes, and it will not be easy to get all of their responses in the 90 seconds that they have to answer the questions that are following. So we're moving into section 1, the Q&A, prepared questions. So candidates will have 90 seconds to answer questions, and our member from ACE Oakland will be asking. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Elliot Williams and Irene from Courage to start our questions.
Thank you, Carol. So of course, I'm going to start with, if each of the candidates can answer, what are your top 3 priority issues in your campaign, and quickly why? And we'll start with Mia.
Top 3 priorities for me are, first, making sure that we have an equitable COVID recovery. That means not only from a health perspective, but also from an economic perspective, as far too many of us have been impacted in terms of housing, economic recovery, our right to our jobs, and health within that, as well as education. Second priority for me is ensuring that we have an ability to reopen our schools. When we closed our schools, we closed down our economy, and we put too much on to bear for parents and families to have to be able to support their children in that moment. And that includes transforming education so it's stronger, from childcare education all the way to post-secondary opportunities for all of our children. And thirdly, to be able to get at some of the core root issues that we're experiencing in this district, in particular related to addressing homelessness and affordable housing.
Thank you, Mia. And then that question next goes to Janani.
First, housing is a human right. Second, workers deserve a living wage. And finally, community safety begins with us. Firstly, I'm not just saying housing is a human right like many of our political leaders. I want to take specific actions to repeal the laws that make sure that housing is currently a commodity rather than a human right, including by repealing the Ellis Act and Costa-Hawkins, 2 initiatives I've worked on as a tenants' rights attorney and advocate, extending our eviction moratorium, and funding affordable housing through a wealth tax. Second, living wages. I want to raise the minimum wage to $22 an hour because it is unacceptable that half of Californians who live in poverty actually work a full-time job. Absolutely no one should be living in poverty, including those who work full-time jobs. And finally, community safety is not defined by our carceral system. We have poured in, millions of dollars every year to fund systems that do not keep us safe, to fund systems that have allowed 1,172 people to be killed by police last year. So I will work to pass legislation that supports the growth of organizations, including those that I work with in this district, like MH First, like Men Creating Peace, like the San Quentin Restorative Justice Project, and others that do the meaningful work to support our communities and get to the roots of violence rather than put a Band-Aid on it by our racist and unjust carceral systems.
So question 2 for our housing section will be asked by ACE member Christine Miller.
Hi, this is Christine Miller. Hi, this is Christine Miller, and I'm an ACE member. I've been with ACE for 5 years, and I'd like to ask of all 3 members, candidates, what would you do to ensure the repeal of Costa-Hawkins and the Ellis Act?
Firstly, with regard to Costa-Hawkins, I am shocked. I mean, I'm dismayed that Prop 21 passed, but I think it's about our messaging. We need to show Californians that and our state lawmakers that Costa-Hawkins is not a tool to constrain cities. It's a tool that's going to free up the abilities of cities like Oakland who want to expand rent control, to single family homes and expand vacancy control. With regard to, and it's about messaging, which unfortunately developers and corporations hijacked in the last election. With regard to the Ellis Act, I was a part of the coalition that spearheaded the legislation that was introduced by Alex Lee, AB 854, an assembly member who's endorsing me in this race, and helped build a broad-based coalition across the East Bay to get it on the table in the first place. Oakland lawmakers, there are so many individuals in the course of this pandemic that I've personally worked with who were evicted during this pandemic because of the Ellis Act. There are jurisdictions across California that didn't know what the Ellis Act was, but because it was one of the greatest loopholes and the easiest loopholes for landlords to use was a tool to evict long-term rent control tenants. And the way that I want to advocate for it is by making sure that AB 854 passes and by making sure that more individuals are aware of the havoc that it's wreaked, not only in cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, but all across California.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I also support the full repeal of Costa-Hawkins and the full repeal of the Ellis Act as we need to. The way that we're going to be able to get that done, though, is by ensuring that the 18 million Californians who rent the place that they call home are actually able to be centered in the conversation. Legislators know, and for years, for decades, have treated Costa-Hawkins, the repeal of Costa-Hawkins and the repeal of the Ellis Act as the legislative third rail. So we're dealing with people who have been focused on housing production in a way that doesn't center tenants in that. So we need to ensure that tenants are at the table, that they're focused on protecting our displacement, unjust evictions, unaffordable rents, and other affronts to our dignity, livelihood, security, and safety. I, as somebody who was a renter for 30 years, who experienced the kind of lecherous landlords and evictions that came at the hands of landlords who were able to take advantage of proposals like the Ellis Act, know full well what happens when you don't have tenants at the table. So one is make sure that tenants are at the table. Two is make sure that you're actually talking to and building coalitions, not only amongst legislators, but amongst community groups so that those voices can be heard. You don't get that by shouting out in a corner alone. You get that by making sure that you're understanding what legislators are facing in their own districts and creating a common cause around the need to be able to support our 18 million Californians who are experiencing rental injustice.
And thank you all for those answers. And we are moving on to question number 3 that will be asked by ACE member Kathy Galanos.
Yes, even as people lost income during the pandemic through no fault of their own, tenants found themselves continuing to owe rent month after month. This has left many renters in rent debt or in a situation where they have turned to using credit cards or other forms of loans to make monthly rent. What is your view about what should be done to address rent debt and credit debt?
And before we get into the order of that question, my ink was smeared. That is Katie, not Kathy. I just wanted to clarify that.
I think one of the things that I faced, I actually paid for my rent several times using my credit card and did that cashback thing that put me into more debt when I was in my 20s. So I know this situation all too well. I think one of the things that the state needs to do is expand out the rent relief program to ensure that it also includes the ability to pay for utility programming, utilities, because they're all the more costly and what will end up showing up on credit card debts. I think that the state has the ability to be able to work through renters and with creditors to ensure that those debts are automatically waived and renters can apply any rent subsidies to their credit cards with ease of process. There's a lot of friction in the system that keeps renters from being able to access the kinds of services and supports that they need. And one of the things that the state can do well, if it puts its mind to it, is get rid of that friction. I think that there's tension in the way that the EDD has worked with different rental subsidy programs and that's a problem. And finally, I think we also need to invest significantly into the infrastructure that is our nonprofit support system, the fourth arm of government that are actually the first responders, first on the ground, and frontliners working with people who are experiencing rental relief, needing rental relief, and experiencing issues related to rent debt and credit debt to be able to support them.
The reality is that less than 40% of tenants who've owed rental debt during this pandemic got any kind of relief. In some counties, as low as 2% of tenants who owed rental debt got relief. I've been part of coalitions like ACE, who said from day one that SB 91 was flawed, but no, we didn't even get a chance to argue the merits of AB 15 on the assembly floor. We said it was going to be, SB 91 was going to be used as a tool to evict long-term rent control tenants, and that is unfortunately exactly what's happening now. So what I would do is firstly cancel rental debt for all individuals during the pandemic through a true rent relief program. I've signed on to Oakland's petition to make housing a human right and would advocate for petitions like this at the state level. Secondly, I would address landlord coercion, which is a large part of the reason why tenants could not take advantage of SB 91 during this pandemic. Evictions are not just about a notice at your door. It's about the subliminal threats to you, your credit scores, your future ability to rent, and that's not being addressed by legislation. Third, I would make sure that we have provisions to ensure that rental debt owed during the pandemic does not affect credit scores, which SB 91 does not do thoroughly enough, and mask all evictions that have happened due to pandemic-related debt. And finally, I would fight for a right to counsel, to litigate these issues eventually or negotiate with landlords, because we know that enough individuals are going to be evicted, and it's unjust that 90% of landlords have an attorney and 90% of tenants don't.
And up next, we have Norma Sanchez from ACE Oakland.
Yo soy Norma Sánchez, pertenezco a ACE en Oakland. Los activistas de la justicia de la vivienda han estado promoviendo cada vez más los fideicomisos de tierra como un buen modelo de garantizar el acceso de viviendas permanentemente accesibles, donde la tierra residencial es propiedad de una entidad comunal o organización sin fines de lucro, y las viviendas se hacen la prioridad de los miembros de la comunidad. Yo les quiero hacer una pregunta. ¿Hasta qué punto lucharían para financiar los fideicomisos de tierra como una opción para promover viviendas accesibles en el distrito?
Gracias, Norma. And I will go ahead and interpret what Norma was just asking. And as a reminder, we're still in the housing section of our Q&A. And Norma is introducing herself as an ACE member. And her question was that housing justice advocates have increasingly been turning to land trusts as a model meant to ensure the availability of permanently affordable housing, where residential land is owned by a nonprofit or communal entity, and the housing is made available to members of the community. And her question is, to what extent would you fight to fund land trusts as an option for promoting affordable housing in the district?
I think public land trusts are a wonderful tool that has been underutilized to ensure that we can keep residents in their homes. We know that the mortgage financing in the way that it's structured right now doesn't allow for people to be able to purchase a home, and it certainly doesn't allow for people to stay in their home when they need to be able to do that. Recognizing that we need over 185,000 low-income rental units in Alameda County, we need to make sure that we're building affordable housing, transit-oriented housing, housing, and that doesn't displace and gentrify housing. So community land trusts allow us a vehicle that has not been made widely available to be able to do this. We need to be able to fund this as part of the $12.5 billion that the state is dedicating towards housing areas, to make it one of the prongs that we have the ability to use to ensure that people, particularly people of color who have been left out of the financing system, out of the banking system entirely, to be able to ensure that they have the resource to be able to use a land trust as a very viable option to be able to ensure that they can stay in their homes, purchase homes, and stay landed.
Janani?
I absolutely support both the growth and expansion of community land trusts like the ones we have in Oakland. To me, they're a powerful tool to help take housing out of the capitalist speculative market and allow a sense of equity in housing and embrace models that are rooted in cultural values. And my interest with community land trusts in particular is to focus on preservation and stewardship to enable land trusts to purchase naturally occurring housing as they're sold, as they're released from their owners, to make sure that they don't reach the speculative market, because we know that market speculators are a huge part of the reason why land prices are so high, why the cost of living is so high, and why people are evicted through evictions like the Ellis Act. And in order to fund this type of program, ironically using the capitalist structure by imposing a wealth tax on all individuals who make over $50 million a year, who have a net worth of over $50 million a year. I also believe we need to fund these programs through redevelopment dollars and enable the return of redevelopment dollars to cities to be able to decide how to use this funding to both build affordable housing and support community land trusts like the ones that we have right here in Oakland.
Our next question, and I just also want to give a shout out to Norma for her question. Oftentimes we don't make the space necessary for bilingual speakers, and we try to ensure that we do that at ACE Action. And so I just want to thank you for your questions. Thank you. That said, we are going to our next question to be asked by an ACE member about TOPA.
This question is in reference to local Oakland ordinance, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, also known as TOPA. She says, Norma says, housing is a human right. There are many unhoused folks. One solution to make sure that people have housing could come in the form of TOPA. All renters under this ordinance would have the opportunity to become owners of their own homes. For example, Norma is in a similar situation since she lives in a land trust. What TOPA would do and the related funding would do is it would help tenants have the first opportunity to own the home they live in if the owner chooses to sell it. So before it goes to the free market, it would go to the current occupants first. So the question is, even though this is a local matter, I guess extrapolating to the statewide as well, is what would you do to fund this type of program? Either with residential property or perhaps hotels being converted as well.
And I want to also articulate that TOPA is moving in Alameda County and more than just the city of Oakland. So I want to be clear on that. And we can go ahead and take answers.
Muchas gracias, Norma, por su pregunta. Thank you so much for your question, Norma. Good to see you again. And I wholeheartedly support TOPA because it is essential to land preservation, which is essential to anti-displacement, so our community members can stop getting gentrified out of their own neighborhoods. And it's a tool to enable people to achieve the dream of home ownership through programs that allow tenants to have the right of first refusal. And this is essential because we still have not repealed Costa-Hawkins. Cities don't have the ability to implement vacancy control so that when a unit is passed on to a new owner, and when tenants do move out of a unit for whatever reason, that the landlords have full ability to make that very unit market rate. So we cannot, under our current system, keep low-income units or affordable housing units or long-term rent control units affordable. And to me, TOPA is a part of the solution to racist redlining policies. You know, with our with Black communities leaving Oakland, with many communities of color leaving Oakland, we need to start taking proactive measures in the way that historically we did to white low-income communities when it came to squatters' rights. We need to reverse the legacy of racism in allowing individuals to get on a path to home ownership, which currently is our status quo. And I would fund it through both the wealth tax and the land speculator tax.
We all know that one of the ways that we're able to accumulate wealth is through home ownership. It's something that because of the kind of redlining and exclusionary practices that we've experienced, particularly in this district, we haven't been able to take advantage of that wealth accumulation, but through home ownership. So I am in full support of TOPA and believe that there's an ability to take the model that Oakland has really spearheaded and make it something that we can rely on across the state of California, particularly in areas where that are far less progressive than we are in this district, to be able to ensure we have the ability to do that. I think we need to be able to look at creating alternate financing structures, one by ensuring that we have a pathway to be able to support that first right of refusal when a tenant wants to become a homeowner of the place that they called home for so long. They have the ability to receive revolving loan financing mechanisms that would allow them to be able to have a loan that would take into account a different structure in terms of the amount of funds that they had available for deposit, their credit score, their credit history, because unfortunately, down payments in our district are far too high for anyone to be able to absorb independently. So we need to ensure that the state is paying for ability to have alternative mortgaging and financing structures to enable expansion of TOPA.
Thank you. And our next question will be asked by Irene from Courage, California.
Thank you, Carol. So now several of you have mentioned how bills have either been killed or amended or moved to 2-year bills. So I'd love to hear, what do you think needs to be done to get more bills that people in our communities are demanding, to actually get them passed in Sacramento?
I think the way that we get a progressive agenda in Sacramento passed is by making sure that we're building coalitions inside, around, and all throughout the building. So the first thing is that we need to ensure that the outside game is strong, where we have advocacy organizations, service organizations, and individuals that are impacted across the state coming together to be able to lobby their legislators. The power of an individual voice and the power of hundreds of thousands of voices are incredibly important. And I think part of what happens is that we have some of that happening in Northern California, and we don't have it replicated to the extent that we need to in Southern California, particularly as it relates to housing and housing justice. We need to make sure that we're winning the hearts and minds of our fellow legislators, not be calling them corporate Democrats, because that's not that alienates people. It doesn't bring people in. So a calling in needs to be happening with our legislators so that they know that they're being responsive to their constituents by addressing some of the issues that we've really talked about in terms of housing justice, housing affordability, and tenants' rights. And we need to ensure that we're not going to back down, and particularly as we in the East Bay are representing Black and Brown communities. We need to ensure that our voice is powerful and that is heard. And we need, in order to be able to do that, you need representation that has the ability to represent the concerns and the progressive agenda, and also work with the people who are standing in our way.
Thank you. And Janani.
Firstly, we need to elect more lawmakers that represent our people, lawmakers that are corporate free and not beholden to special interest groups. So much of our housing legislation goes to die in committee, not because of Republicans, but because of Democrats who don't understand the needs of tenants because they're landlords themselves. And this is the beginning of a possible transformation in our state government. This is the last special election for this year, but we have 34 seats in blue districts open next year. So we have the ability, starting right now with this special election, to elect legislators who are pro-tenant, who are pro-justice, and not just progressive on paper. And the way in which I would work with my fellow lawmakers to inspire people to enact progressive policies is to showcase the stories of the individuals who drove me to run for this seat. There is never a day that goes by where I don't forget the stories of the teen moms experiencing domestic violence and homelessness and sitting on the streets without an opportunity to get shelter. I remember the stories, and I remember the specific laws and state systems that failed them, and I will make sure that my fellow lawmakers understand this too, because finally, these are not just progressive issues anymore. The inequalities in the course of this pandemic that have been going on for decades have been laid bare in this moment. What gives me hope is that when discussing SB 91 and the flawed rental relief program, there was a Republican lawmaker who said tenants' rights might be a progressive issue, but all I know is that my constituents are being evicted in the middle of the pandemic, and I need them protected.